Joining us now on the program, because we're almost at that time, it is quickly approaching, is ESPN Bracketologist Charlie Creme. Charlie, appreciate you for joining us because I know that you are soon to be one of the busiest men in America once March rolls around. But before we get into the field and some of your takeaways from the season so far, I do want to take a step back and just kind of take a philosophical look at women's basketball where we are right now. Every year, it feels like on the men's side, we have Cinderellas, group of 5 teams, mid-major teams that look like they can make legitimate runs to the Elite Eight, Final Four, and potentially even national championship. Why don't we have that on the women's side?
I think, and this is what I tell people a lot, the women's basketball is still on a different timeline than the men. I mean, think back to the NCAA tournament or crowning a national champion via the NCAA in men's basketball started in 1939. It started in 1980 for women's basketball. So there's basically men's basketball's had a 40-year head start in terms of the timeline of how the sport's evolved, how the sport's been treated by athletic departments, by media. So I wouldn't call it catch-up mode. It's just that there's a different trajectory that we're working with women's basketball. And I think it's important to remember that in the comparison and be patient. And the growth has been outstanding and it's been exciting and it's been a lot of fun. But it's still not where men's basketball in the 70s was different than women's basketball in the 70s. And it's still different today to some degree in terms of that. Now, in terms of attention and people's watching and people reading and paying attention, I think that gap is closed closer than that 40-year gap that I indicated. So there is a catch-up mode that's happening I think at breakneck speed. But we're not there yet in terms of just the depth maybe of the sport in terms of competition quite yet. It's better. It's certainly better than it was, although, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, a little bit later. This year may not be the best example of that, given that the 4 best teams in the country are the same 4 teams who played in the Final Four a year ago, and the champ is the current lone undefeated team left in the country. But I think your question is great. And I've had these conversations before, and I think that's what I always point to is just remember the track is different. And women's basketball has had little moments where we get Cinderellas popping in there, but it hasn't been the consistency I think that you indicated with the men. But we'll get there. It's coming.
Because of all of the changes in college basketball as a whole right now, NIL, all of that kind of stuff, what is the recipe to have more Cinderellas in the future then? Is it about the bracket? Is it about just building depth? Is it something completely different that you see coming down the line?
I think it all kind of starts with getting the right coach. And there's a lot of programs that have done that. They've made coaching changes, and that coach has been the recipe for success. I mean, you look at Texas. Texas has always been a historically good program, but wasn't having big time national success more recently until Vic Schaefer got there. They found the right coach, and he's turned them into a national title contender, whereas a few years before his arrival, they were essentially maybe a Sweet 16 contender. So I think that's a big part of it. And part of being that right coach is knowing the recruiting base, bringing in the high levels of talent. And some of that now has to do with the commitment of athletic departments to women's basketball in the NIL space. So there's all of those things are configuring to form what's a successful program and what's not a successful program. I think we've seen it with regard to the transfer portal and NIL in football, bring a little bit more balance, if you want to call it that, or spread out the abilities to succeed. Because I think you could point to football from a few years ago, and it was the same teams over and over and over again. And now when people would complain about that with women's basketball, they were big college football fans. They would say, "Hey, come on, what are we really talking about here? It's the same teams in college football too." That has changed a little bit in the last couple of years, and I think there's something there. If there's a non-traditional powerhouse women's basketball program or 2 or 10 that want to invest a little bit more in women's basketball, they see the payoff there, then if the finances are there to spend on rosters, because let's face it, that's what's happening in football and in men's basketball as well, then I think you'll start to see some of the talent spread out a little bit more. I do think we still see a talent base that tends to focus on the same schools. And while we do have a lot of women's basketball players transferring, I think the big time programs, if you really look at South Carolina, say, or UConn, for instance, those players tend not to leave those programs. Whereas in some of the other sports, it doesn't matter what the program is or who the coach is, players leave. So hats off to those programs and those coaches. They keep their players. And in women's basketball, obviously, you can keep a formed roster if as long as they're not transferring, they're not going pro like the men are after a season. So you keep that core group together, you're going to be able to build that ability to dominate. And when you're turning over things, it's more subtle. Whereas sometimes with men's programs, you're turning over 6, 7, 8 players season after season, and you're going to get some inconsistency in success rates. And some people would point to that as a good thing, but it also points to constantly that constant turnover means there's less to identify with the men's side of things too.
I think that's another reason why it's been so easy to tune into and to root for women's college basketball is these players are sticking around for 4 or 5 years. It's so much easier to fall in love with a personality whenever they're not one and done, and you can kind of learn them and watch them grow year over year. But, we mentioned how there's so much chalk this year. UConn's the best team in the country. South Carolina, Texas, UCLA, the teams that we've seen, at least in recent history, successful are the best teams in the country this year. But we also have Vanderbilt, who was just handed their first loss of the season after a 20-game win streak. We have Princeton, that's only lost 1 game so far this season. Looking at the entire field, who has been the biggest surprise to you up until this point?
I think you hit on Vanderbilt. I thought they'd be good. I didn't foresee top 5 good. That's for sure. I didn't see 20 games in a row good. Michaela Blake's obviously was great last year, and she's great this year. And when and that is another part of, how do we expand the contenders? Well, when you can land a player, a non-traditional program, say like Vanderbilt, they have a decent history, but not so much recently. But when you can land a player like that, it's program changing. I often talk about, people talk about who's the best player in the history of XYZ program. I like to look at who's the most important player, because sometimes you just get that one right player that sort of flips the script, and then the ball starts rolling down the hill a little bit easier. And then you become a more traditional, you go into that little world of traditional power. You win year after year after year because now you've created this momentum within the program. So I would point for all those reasons. I would point to Vanderbilt as being a surprise. Georgia is another team that's much better than I anticipated, and this is the example of grabbing the right transfer and then making it work very quickly with chemistry. And Danny Carnegie has been kind of a godsend to that program, because where Georgia has struggled in the last few years, number one, being in the SEC is never easy, but they could always defend, but had a lot of trouble scoring against the better teams in the SEC. Well, Carnegie seems to have changed that, or at least on some level, and made them offensively competent. Or maybe you go as far as to say a good offensive team. So now they can score with some of the better teams in the league, and they've elevated. I think they might have been picked 14th in the SEC at the beginning of the year, and they're clearly a top half of the conference. I have them as a 7 seed right now. I think I had them as a fringe tournament team, maybe. It's at different points early in the season, and certainly not in the preseason at all.
We're going to get into a lot of bracketology specific questions with you, but in terms of that with Vanderbilt and Georgia, like, when you're going into building your bracket, especially because I think you started at the beginning of this season this year, right? And you've done it
now
every
I
month or
started
so?
in April of the year before.
Oh, jeez.
and it starts weekly the soon as the season starts.
No
Okay.
rest for the weary.
People seem to like it, even when it's mostly conjecture and it's not really based on much. But I think I've gotten to the point now where I've got a pretty good grasp of who we can start with, and then we wait for them to really get going in the schedule, and then we make adjustments as necessary.
Well, that's one of my big questions is how much, especially early on, is this just the eye test that you're watching games? And how much of it is looking at the quad 1 and 2 and 3 wins and the resume that they're building in terms of the nitty gritties?
That is a great question. It sort of talks about what's the timeline of the evolution of a singular season of bracketology. And obviously, when you're doing a preseason bracket, there's no data to go on. There's no metrics to measure. You're kind of going on what you know. You're looking at the transfer portal. You're looking at recruiting classes. You're looking at the history of some of these coaches and returning players and all of that. And you're building kind of what might make sense. And really, that sort of continues, I'd say, for at least the first month, maybe 6 weeks of the season, because November you do get a lot of really good games in November where you can start to measure teams, at least empirically, with not just data but an actual eye test. You're watching them play, and I'd say that the numbers or the net rankings and things like that really kind of start to come into play mid-December. Certainly when we hit January 1st, that's when things sort of switch. Conference play begins in earnest. In most leagues now, it starts a little bit in December, but it really starts as the regular part of the schedule for everybody. And the data starts to have some real meaning. You're forming enough examples of how a team plays and how it performs so the numbers really do bear accuracy. So I think that's sort of, and then that's when I start doing 2 brackets a week, because now that when we hit January, we're into the new year. We're into the year that the season is identified with that year's tournament, and the wheels start moving a lot faster. So I'd say that's when I kind of come out of your New Year's Day slumber. I rub my eyes and say, okay, we're really going.
The bear is awake.
That's sort of the timeline. I mean, I'm working certainly in November and December, but it starts to take, because people start to pay attention to now that college football lasts a couple more weeks into January than it used to. But nonetheless, I think people who are into basketball say, oh, okay, now we're going to start playing familiar teams. So now maybe it's a little more identifiable that when South Carolina is playing Texas or LSU, then you like, oh, okay, I know these games. These make sense to my memory. So let's start paying attention.
And in that kind of same breath, in terms of, weighting resumes, because I'm sure you are tasked with comparing resumes that have a razor thin difference and a razor thin margin between the two of them. So how do you weigh early season non-conference games versus maybe what's more recent? Because you can't totally ignore what happens in November and December, but you also want to give teams credit for getting better throughout the course of the season. So how do you kind of weigh those two things?
Yeah, I try to follow the committee's lead. I mean, my job essentially is to follow the same sort of format or process or thought process even that they follow. And so you look for clues in some of the things that the committee chair will say when we have a chance to talk to him or her during when we do the top 16 reveals, when the NCAA selection committee offers those up to the public. I ask certain questions, or I really listen to what they say for their rationale to give me a clue as to what they might be thinking when we get to the selection Sunday. So if they mention things like, oh, they had this big win in November, even though we're in February, then I know they're really thinking about that non-conference. I certainly think November and December are very important. I've written numerous articles about you cannot ignore this. It's a full season. When we talk about full body of work, November and December are certainly part of that. All those non-conference games they do matter. But you're also watching games, you're watching teams, and you're watching how they evolve. And you do have to take into consideration this team looks a lot better now than they did previously. Or you have to look at the differences and say, well, is it true? Are they truly better? Is the competition changed? What am I seeing? What are the numbers saying? The best example of that this year is Duke, right? They had a really rough November and December. And now they look like one of the top, certainly 20 teams in the country. Now, the ACC kind of also had a down year. Now Duke's only playing ACC teams. So there's where that razor thin thinking comes into play. Is it truly Duke? Is there a little bit of the competition isn't as good because the ACC isn't as good? I tend to think it's more Duke in this instance, this example, that they are truly better, a lot better, and that I'm not going to knock them because the ACC didn't have a great non-conference run either, and now they're just playing each other. So is it just sort of cannibalism in a sense? But no, you watch Duke, and I think you can see a different team. Like the team that lost to West Virginia when West Virginia only had 5 eligible players to go back on the floor in the second half, versus the team that is playing NC State and Notre Dame, and like that's a different team. It's clearly a different team, and I think anybody would notice that. So all of that goes into play. How much you weigh it, and that's where the subjectivity of this stuff comes into play, and that's where the committee has 12 different people with their own set of ideas of how that should be applied. And I have to sort of try to think like 12 people I don't even know. And so you base that kind of on, like I said, what they say and some historical decision-making that they've made. And most of the time it hits, but that's, like I said, that's where the subjective part comes in. And my mind could be a little bit different than any one of those 12 people.
The number 1 seeds get a lot of attention, and for good reason, right? And then you have that 4-5 where it's hosting or not hosting. But for you, when you're doing this, where are the margins closest for you? Like, where is it most difficult to bracket teams? What section of the bracket?
I think it is that 4-5, that top 16 situation. Most years, you have a pretty clear-cut idea of at least 2 or 3 of the number 1 seeds. And this year, it's pretty clear-cut on all 4, at least for now. But LSU's they're lurking, I think, when they still get to play South Carolina and they still get to play Texas again. But it's really that who gets into that top 16, because it's so important in women's basketball with the ability to host those games. It's revenue. It's your fan base being that much more engaged, because now you've got 2 more games, the 2 most important games of the season. You get to play on your home floor. And the coaches love to be able to not have to travel. So that's a huge piece of it. And I think of those layers, there's who are the number 1 seeds? Who are the 4 seeds versus the 5 seeds? And who's on the bubble and just misses the field because they're on the wrong side of the bubble? The top 16, I think, is the most difficult. It's also the most important. And because some people would argue, well, the bubble's more important. Making it into the field is a difference maker too financially. It is. But we talked about the depth of the women's game. It's not as deep. The bubble usually comes down to, frankly, just a couple of teams. Sometimes in the top 16, you're looking at 3-4 teams on the outside looking in that have a legitimate case still to be in the top 16. And it comes down to those razor thin margins. So I think that's where I put a lot of the scrutiny on myself, because I know that's very important. And I'll say this, in recent years, as a member of the ESPN family, ESPN broadcasting the entire tournament, there's a quick turnaround from Selection Sunday to those first 4 games. Mm-hmm. So the people that are in charge of putting production teams together to go out and broadcast these games actually lean on my opinion on those top 16 teams to get a jump on things. If I'm really wrong, I'm letting a lot of people with a lot of money riding on stuff down. So I
It's the
put
pressure.
scrutiny on myself. If that's for the only reason, is there, Charlie, we're going to go off your bracket to start getting our production teams in line and start ordering trucks to go to these cities. Okay.
I want to go all the way back. You said LSU is lurking. And I think
Yes.
for a lot of people, especially given the past few years with LSU's non-conference schedule, like, can you just explain to people how LSU is always lurking? Is it because they play in the SEC? Like, what is going on?
Well, they're super talented, I think. And the fact that they now have a couple of wins. You're right. They didn't play a non-conference schedule worth anything. You can't take any of the games they played outside of they played Duke and take anything away from it. It meant nothing. I know a lot of people talked about how they scored over 100 points, a whole bunch. And I even mentioned it a few times in things I wrote. But the fact of the matter is the level of competition there has to be an asterisk there. The level of competition was not becoming of a team. But we all knew how talented they were and are. And some of their younger players are now starting to play really well to go with this core group of veterans that they have. And we know that they have a great coach. And their net numbers are still, even though their schedule numbers are not good, their overall net number is good. And it puts them at least in that you got to have that conversation about them. And when I say they're lurking, it's because the way the SEC is this year, it's so good. It's so great at the top with so many teams competing for. We got two teams right now on the 1 line and 2 teams right now on the 2 line. And I think it's 6 teams in the top 16. At times it's been 8 on my board. There is a ton of opportunity there if you're LSU to win games that are going to get people's attention. They're going to add to that quad 1 total, and they're going to build that resume. And they're good enough. They're truly good enough, deep enough, and well coached enough that they can beat the Texas or the South Carolinas, which would then give them an opportunity to bump up to that 1 line, replacing one of those 2. I don't think there's any way UConn or UCLA comes off that 1 line. LSU's not going to bump one of those 2 off because, frankly, UConn's unlikely to lose a game this year, and UCLA probably not going to lose again either. The Big Ten's really good, but they're head and shoulders above everybody else. Texas and South Carolina don't have as big a gap between themselves and LSU and Vanderbilt, Oklahoma. And we saw Oklahoma beat South Carolina the other night. And then we saw South Carolina turn around and boat race Vanderbilt. So, but the margin there is much smaller, and they can be had. As I just don't think UCLA or UConn can be had at this point in all likelihood. And they've built up enough of a cushion where it's, even if they are upset, it's not going to matter.
You mentioned UConn. Wagons, the lone undefeated team in women's college basketball. They're beating everybody by 20 plus points. From what you've seen from just your eye test, from the numbers, all of the analytics, their resume right now, is there a chance that this UConn team is actually better than the national championship winning team last season?
I think it is. And I think when you say it out loud that, a team who lost Paige Becker's got better.
Yeah, right.
You feel like you'd be wearing a straitjacket to say something like that. It doesn't make any sense. But the fact is they're deeper. Sarah Strong is that much better, and she is a unbelievable talent. AZ Fudd is a better player. And frankly, they've played better. Like last year's UConn team had those bumps because they weren't quite playing well. They were coached, and you could kind of see it. You talked to Gino after they beat South Carolina badly in last season, that he was coaching this team incrementally to get them ready to be at their best in March, and they clearly were. This team just was great from the beginning, and they haven't really let up. It's really, they're playing at the same level that they played at right from the start. The problem with UConn, though, is they don't get tested in the Big East this year. And so many of their games are, you watch it for the first quarter and a half, and then it's kind of not where I'm going to turn the channel because I've seen what I need to see. They do have Tennessee coming up this weekend, and they have played. They always play a good non-conference schedule, but they've had their way with that too. So yes, I think they are actually better. The results are better. And maybe if you're talking to Gino Auriemma and he says, no, I mean, Paige was one of the best players I've ever coached. No way we're better. But the fact is, the numbers and the results are better than they were last year.
Gino's too busy talking about Connecticut pizza to worry about if his team is worse.
It is good pizza.
To bring it all the way back before we let you go, because we kind of started talking about the parity of the game, there are a lot of mid-majors that obviously make the tournament, automatic bids. How do you go about bracketing them?
Well, that's a great question. There's where November and December really come into play.
Okay.
There's a certain group of mid-major, if you will call them that, programs that do schedule and get the bigger dogs to schedule them. And if they in a particular year have maybe a little bit better and they knock off one of them, well, then that puts them in a position to be higher seeded. This year, we don't have that many of them. I think Princeton is really the only mid-major of sorts that's seeded inside single digits. But in years past, we've had Gonzaga. I think was it 2 years ago was a top 16 team because they beat Stanford in the non-conference. They dominated the WCC, and then they made the Sweet 16. They were that good. South Dakota State's another one that really schedules. Middle Tennessee usually schedules. They're not having a very good year this year, but they have had seasons recently where they were pretty talented and were good enough to be seeded in the kind of the 8-9 range. So a lot of it does go back to strength of schedule. Were you able to schedule games, and did you get one? Did you beat somebody that you're quote unquote not supposed to beat? And that's usually where we start to look at. Then we dig into kind of what do the metrics tell us? How have they continued to play as they get into their leagues that may not be quite as competitive? Did they truly dominate that league? And that's another thing. It's usually for the mid-majors, if they want a single digits type seed, usually requires no more than one loss in their league. They better really be dominant, and they better have had some kind of noteworthy non-conference either schedule or a win. Competing even in playing a series of really good teams, Power 4 conference teams, but competing, but maybe not even winning, still is it's a subjective measure, but it's still a measurable. Competitive in losses is a metric or a piece of criteria that the committee uses. So that's something I like it too. Were those games competitive? Were they tournament? Were they competitive against tournament-worthy teams? Could they adjudicate themselves nicely in the tournament based on past results? And if the answer is yes, based on November and December, then we start looking at them as a 7, as an 8, as a 9, something like that.
Quality loss is my favorite little oxymoron that we use so often around this time. It's real. It is very real, but it is the theme of March, it feels like at times. Charlie Creme, you are a genius. You're an encyclopedia. You are the wizard of bracketology. Thanks so much for hanging out with us and sharing so much of your insight.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a great conversation. I love it.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks, Charlie.